Welcome. We're on the red couch for part 2 of our civil rights series with Neil Phillips, founder of Visible Men, an organization dedicated to mentoring and leading Black men and boys to new heights of success. He's the principal of Visible Men Academy, a charter school in Manatee County, Florida, dedicated to providing boys with outstanding academic character and social education in a nurturing school environment. Join us now for a candid conversation about race in America. Neil, thank you for coming back.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Rachel.
I love having you.
It's great to be here.
So you talk about the tired old conversations about race in America.
Yeah.
Tell me more about what you mean by that.
Well, it's, the work that I do, you're always in close touch with the issue of race in America. And when I think back on the number of conversations about race that I've been involved with, whether it be at an institutional level and diversity initiatives or conversations around a table that are more informal, it's rare that I recall many of them that ended with some sense of real progress. I feel like we recycle the same issues and most sadly in the same ways, and that we all feel restricted in some ways. It's difficult to talk about race. For Black people, it's difficult for different reasons than it is for white people, and for folks who have encountered racism in very direct ways. It's difficult for them in certain ways. It's difficult for people who feel like if they say the wrong thing in the wrong way, that they'll get labeled in a certain way. So there are all these tensions around conversations around race that I think prevent us from really getting to the heart of the matter and really having the kinds of conversations that could advance things. So when I talk about tired old conversations, it refers to that. Like, how can we find ways to break through to a different level of discourse around this so we can actually progress?
How can we? I mean, now that you've said it,
Yeah.
I want to know how we can.
Well, I think one way, I don't think it's an easy question to answer, but one way, in a way that I've really latched onto, is to have a conversation that acknowledges that there are certain truths that we need to accept as a society, and that if we accept those truths, then it will help us feel more open and honest in our conversations. And it will also help us be more open to differing opinions, differing perspectives, because I think part of what makes it so difficult is the defensiveness we all feel when something is said in a way that doesn't feel comfortable to us. Right. It strikes at our hearts and our souls, and it hits us very deeply. And that causes us to shrink, causes us to retreat, it causes us to judge. All of those things are just the opposite of what you need to advance an authentic conversation. So I really do think that this notion of truths and getting to a point where we can say, okay, we feel like we can all agree on those things, and then we can talk. I think that to me is one of the ways that we could kind of break through a little bit. Yeah,
that's good. You know, you talk about the white elephant in the room, and Black men carry this history, this tragic history of slavery.
Sure.
So how, kind of in keeping with what we were just talking about, how can we honor that history and that story while still moving forward?
Yeah, and I think that's a really critical piece. I think both need to happen. I work with young people, and it's about preparing them for the future, and so I'm very much oriented toward how we move forward. I also believe that we can't move forward by ignoring the past. And I think that that's a really important piece, is that we have to be able to remain connected to our past, connected to the pride that many of us feel in overcoming difficult circumstances, a difficult history, what our fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, our ancestors have done to position us to be in position to be more successful. All those things are really important to us. So that past is not something that we're eager to discard or to ignore. We actually want to stay very attached to it. And we have to find ways to be able to continue to advance. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an and you talk about the history of slavery, and that's a deep, painful history for our country, for black and white people for different reasons. I think that what is so important is for us to think of all of the accomplishments, historical and present day, that black people have made, continue to make. I personally, and this is controversial, I'm not a huge fan of Black History Month. I feel like things like that, though I understand the purpose for celebrating our past accomplishments in history and some real key, critical, important figures in our history, I would love to see it not need a designated month. I'd love to see it woven into the fabric of who we are, and that it's just a part of American history in a way that's commonplace. So things like that, I think, would help us sort of acknowledge not just the painful past, but also the really sort of encouraging and inspiring history, and also the present and future.
Yeah. You spoke at something called the Nantucket Project.
Yes.
Tell me what that was, and tell me about what you spoke about.
Yeah, the Nantucket Project is an annual event held on the island of Nantucket in Massachusetts, and it brings together personalities, thought leaders, entrepreneurs from many different facets of life. So there are politicians there, there are folks in the medical field, the business world, technology, education. So I was invited to speak, to talk about this issue of race in America. And the theme of this most recent Nantucket Project event was Seek the Truth, Endure the Consequences.
I love the title of yours.
Yeah, so I titled my talk Race to Truth. And really what it was about was this idea of presenting truths so that we could find a way to break through on how we deal with race in America and try to advance ourselves even more. I mean, last year was the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And it got me thinking about how far we've traveled during that 50 years. I mean, that's half a century. And as I think about how far we've traveled, I feel good about some of the progress. And then in some ways, I feel like, wow, we're recycling similar conversations over and over again. And we haven't gone far enough. We haven't advanced far enough. So my talk, Race to Truth, was really based on how we break through to another stage in our evolution as a country around race relations.
Yeah. One of the things you talked about was blackness. So I'd love for you to define blackness and talk about why it's limiting.
Yeah. So your question almost provides me the answer. The notion that it would need to be defined, I find limiting in and of itself. To me, when I hear the word blackness, or when it talks about the concept of blackness, it feels to me most often that it is alluding to a certain way that one is black, or a way to be black, or a way to represent or display that you are black.
Like a stereotypical thing.
That's right, and I find that very limiting. I feel like we as black people, but as a nation, would be well served to make sure that being black can and should be as expansive as being white or Asian or any other race or ethnicity. And the notion that there is a certain way to be black, I find limiting, and I find damaging to the progress on race relations in America.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, every culture seems to have some kind of stereotypical way that people think about it or look at it, and it's always like putting on blinders. Yeah.
Well, what's really interesting about it is that a lot of the tension is around the ways that people outside of that race or ethnicity put limitations on that particular group, and I think a concept like blackness can often be limiting ourselves as black people. And so when you think about the ways that that those kinds of stereotypes are limiting when others put those on a particular group, we should also think about how they're limiting when the group itself puts that on itself.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I want to talk about race and poverty and what your views are the issues separate?
Yeah. Yeah, they are. I mean, race and poverty are two separate things. One is an economic issue. The other is skin color.
Yeah. No, I guess my
with
question
that
was,
said,
why are they often overlapping?
Yeah, well, I think with that said, we're seeing, particularly in the education realm, as one example, that when we look at student performance and we talk about things like the achievement gap, there are indicators that show that while we have been thinking of the achievement gap as a racial issue, there are indicators that show that much of it is actually an economic issue. It's an issue of poverty. And that could be applied to other realms too, not just education. If you look at crime and if you look at recidivism and things like that, you'll see that the economic aspect of the equation is very, very much present. I don't think that the economic aspect always eliminates or overrides the racial aspect, but I do think that oftentimes issues of poverty are actually confused with issues of race and vice versa.
Yeah.
So I think we just need to be really clear about that. You know, one of the things I talk about, we have two young sons, and we moved to the Sarasota area from Washington, D.C. area, a very racially diverse area, and people would ask us, you know, well, geez, you're really compromising a lot on exposing your boys to diversity. Mm-hmm. And now I tell them, I said, well, you know, there are a lot of ways to look at diversity. And my sons are now seeing that poverty is not a black issue.
Right.
Poverty spans across all races and ethnicities. And that's a really helpful lesson for them to see. And I think it sort of underscores the point I'm trying to make about the line between poverty and race.
Yeah, exactly. So in this Nantucket Project, you mentioned that politics are divisive by their very nature. So how do you think politics undermine the issue of race in America?
Yeah, I feel like race, for us to progress as a society, as a country, in terms of our race relations, and really sort of realize the point which so many of us talk about, which is true equality, that is an issue of unity. It's an issue of focusing on what we have in common as a people, not how we're different, because we have so much more in common than we do differences. Right. But when we talk about race, it's often focused on the differences. Politics, particularly in this country, particularly around major elections, the energy is around difference. The energy is around one side versus another. And while I think that's healthy as a check and balance to make sure that we're hearing great ideas and that we're considering different sides of arguments and different approaches to problems, I don't think it contributes or feeds the spirit of unity that we need to address issues of race. So while I understand and appreciate those differences and that conversation needs to be about differences at some level, politics and the energy with which we feed the differences doesn't contribute to unity and unifying race relations in America.
Yeah. You mentioned a whole bunch of really stunning statistics about black men in America. And you also said that communities, particularly the black community, is not outraged or calling for change. So why do you believe that the expectations of black men are so low?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons why the expectations of black men are so low. I think the major reason is that we do spend our time immersed in these tragic statistics. You know, when we talk about the number of black boys who aren't graduating from high school, that graduation rate is it's just below 50% nationwide. When we talk about what that leads to, unemployment, and what that can lead to, you know, crime, and what that leads to, recidivism. I mean, there's this cycle of underachievement in the black male community. We spend a lot of time focusing on that part of the story.
Right.
Necessarily. I think we have to, because those are major problems that we have to address. there is another side to that story, which are black men who are thriving, who are wonderful family men, who are great community men, who are in their chosen fields, whether it be business or medicine or law or entrepreneurism or arts, are thriving and are leaders. You can't really name an industry that doesn't have a black man prominently among its ranks. Yet we don't talk much about that. We don't show that. We don't reveal those statistics. So I think there's a real imbalance in the story that we tell. And it's critical that we tell the full story, not at the expense of the truths around the problems. Those have to continue to be explored and examined and addressed. We also have to tell the other side, and that's really critical as we talk about young people. We have to provide them with a view of the full story and not just the struggle.
And that's partly, I mean, that's how you started the whole thing, was the mentoring aspect of Visible Men. And are there any examples or people that, you know, who are the mentors that come and talk to the boys and show that other side?
Sure. There's a long list of those examples, and we're very fortunate. A key piece of the Visible Men mentoring for us is that there is a local flair to it. We really want our boys to feel that they are connected to our visible men, either geographically, hey, you know, I live in your neighborhood, or connected by similar backstories, stories of upbringing, stories of struggles in school or beyond, stories of overcoming those struggles. That connection is really important to us. And we're very fortunate to have a number of visible men who come in and work with our boys. Recently, we had a barber come in, talk about how he started his barbershop and the path that he had to take. At that session, we also had a financial planner who was there. And the financial planner talked about what he does for people, helps them manage their money, helps them increase their wealth. At one point, one of our second graders asked of our barber, our barber shop store owner, he said, by the way, do you have a financial planner? Right? And it was a wonderful, right, exactly. And it was a wonderful example, a revelation of exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to have our boys have their minds expanded, connect them to future possibility through the lives of these visible men who are accessible, who are right there in their neighborhoods, in their communities. And so we really, really try to magnify that idea of being able to connect with our visible men.
I love that.
Yeah.
So what is it like to be a black man in Sarasota?
Well, I can tell you that I don't walk around thinking of myself as a black man in Sarasota. I just walk around as a human being and citizen, and that's my orientation most of the time. I do notice it at times that I am in the minority in terms of race. You know, there are times where I'm at events, wonderful events. I've been fortunate to, you know, hear some great speakers who come through town or be a part of some wonderful conferences or events. And I look around and notice that I'm either the only black man or one of very few. And I know that there are black men in this community who have a lot to contribute to conversations, who have led wonderfully accomplished lives in all facets of different professional paths, who I know would be wonderful contributors, who would benefit, who would aid in whatever the conversation is, and they're not there. And I notice that, and it saddens me. I feel like it would be a wonderful thing if the city was more integrated in those ways. So, you know, what's important to me is that my wife and my children feel happy and safe here, and we all certainly do. We love this area. We do feel like it could benefit, like many places across the country could benefit from more progressivism around racial and ethnic diversity that isn't just in small pockets, but actually interacts amongst each other.
Well, you're also a diversity crusader.
Yeah.
And that is a huge responsibility. And it seems like it's also a pleasure for you. Like it seems like it's both.
Well, it is. It's both. It is both. I just, in my life, I have benefited so greatly from being around people of differing backgrounds, differing race, ethnicities, different upbringings, different professional pursuits. And when you talk about diversity, in our current day and age, when people hear that word, they immediately jump to race. And race is but one aspect or one revelation of diversity. I mean, there's diversity simply means difference. And I think that when you say diversity, it always needs a descriptor. Are you talking about ethnic diversity? Are you talking about gender diversity? Are you talking about socioeconomic diversity, geographic diversity? And I just feel like we all benefit from being around people who are different than we are and who open our minds to different ways of thinking. And it happens to all of us when we're able to travel, or if we're able to leave our city or our state, if we're able to leave the country. We see that there's so many different ways of looking at things and doing things, and I feel like we all grow that way. And as an educator working with young people, I know that diversity is such a key aspect to their educational pursuits and their educational future and their growth. So I'm a big believer in it, big believer in the benefits of it and the ways that it stretches us and helps us grow, and most importantly, in the ways that it unifies us. You know, amongst all of this difference is a world full of commonalities, and I think it's around those commonalities that really we're all joined at the hip.
Well, you're talking about expanding our minds, and then in the Nantucket Project speech, you were talking about expanding really our hearts and expanding our definition of love to promote change. How can we do that? Like, what are some examples? I just want simple things that, you know, we could just go, I can do that.
Well, I think that as human beings, we display an enormous capacity to love one another, and it reveals itself in so many ways, whether it be philanthropy, volunteerism, at our dinner tables, the ways that we circle and rally around people in need. I mean, there are just countless examples of this as human beings. So I think that our dimension of love, our ability to expand, not just who we love, but how we love them. I think we're all equipped with that capacity, and I think it's a conscious decision. And when you love someone, you care for that person. You have high expectations and standards. You provide them the support to meet those high expectations and standards, and you won't let them fall beyond a certain level. And I feel like if we can just tap into what is absolutely there is a capacity for really expansive and inclusive love, then it will cause us to think a little bit more broadly, in some cases a lot more broadly, about who matters and about who has value to us. And if we can do that on an exponential level, we'll see a lot more out of the people who are struggling. We'll see a lot more about our ability to impact and influence their lives in positive ways. So it really is, if it could be simplified, it boils down to love as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I like the way you're talking about value and valuing ourselves. And that seems like such like the cornerstone piece for your school, and to really help children, and specifically minority boys, to really value themselves. How can we make that happen?
Yeah, I love that question. And one of the ways that feels counterintuitive, the way we value people is by telling them that we expect a lot of them. You know, and that is what we're trying to do at Visible Men Academy in particular, but even beyond that, is when you show someone and you communicate to someone that you expect a lot of them, that you think they're capable of great things, and because you know they're capable of great things, there are high standards of conduct, there are high standards of performance, there are high standards of resilience and perseverance, all of those things. That is how people feel valued, is when people around them hold them in high esteem. So for me, focusing on that aspect of things, high expectations, is a great way to show people that you value who they are.
Well, I love what you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
And I value what you're doing, and I really appreciate this conversation.
Oh, thank you. Well, so do I, Rachel. I appreciate your interest, and it means a lot to me, so thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us
On the Red Couch.